Good morning. God bless you. It is my privilege to be here this morning, and I want to begin by saying thank you very much for the hospitality of the saints here in Vichy. I also want to say thank you very much for last year. I understand there was an offering made, a special offering to purchase a temple in Arraiján. Now, let me give you a little bit of background on the word or the name Arraiján. When the canal was being built by, of course, the North Americans, there was a place that was at the right hand of, well, the address that was given to, well, it's on the right hand. And since Panamanians couldn't pronounce at the right hand correctly, they just call it Arraiján. So that's how the name Arraiján stuck, and that's the name of the city. Okay, so it's a city that's just on the other side of the canal. And right now, my wife and I are in charge of the work here. I'm not the pastor, I'm just the minister in charge. And the offering that was made here completed the price to purchase the property. So it's in our name now, in the church's name right now. And I want to especially say thank you very much for that donation. In fact, we taped a video. It's a few seconds long. I hope the technology won't fail me now. And I want you to, of course, I would have liked to project the video, but we don't have the technology to do that. This is a message from the saints in Arraiján to the saints in Vichy. Thank you very much. Yeah, so that's a thank you message from the saints in Arraiján to the saints in Vichy. Now, they were asking for testimonies, and I want to sing a testimony and song. Now, in Panama, we have a saying, "Se le salió el gallo," referring to when a person is singing and they sing off key. And have you ever heard a person when they stand up to sing a testimony say, "Please pray for me," and what they're saying is, "I don't want to do something that makes me look ridiculous." So I usually tell the saints, listen, do your best for the Lord. Just do your best. Amen. And if the word "se le salió el gallo" literally means you let the rooster come out. That's what it translated literally means. It means you went off key. So what I tell them is, don't worry about that. Just do your best. And if you hear a kikiriki, well, at least you know you gave your best kikiriki for the Lord. Okay? So I want to sing a song that has been very special for me. And let me give you a little bit of background behind the story. It was the year 2006. I was in Germany for some training. And when I was over there, I received a message from my wife that she was very, very ill and practically bedridden. When I came back, I discovered that effectively she had 3 herniated discs. And the prognosis was that she had to be operated upon. And actually, there was no guarantees. There was a real possibility that my beloved wife, could be confined to a wheelchair the rest of her life. That was a prognosis. Of course, those news were devastating for me. My wife, of course, is very, very close to me. And I was driving to work one morning, and I felt overwhelmed with the news. And I was looking for something to encourage me. And I was driving my mom's car, and I was looking just for something to change my thinking. And my sister had given her a Christian CD. So I just popped it in and started listening to the songs. And one of the songs was precisely this one. And it so uplifted and encouraged me that I really had to thank God. And It's part of my testimony now. So I want to share it with you. And if you hear a kikiriki, you know I'm just doing my best for the Lord, okay? The song is entitled, Someone is Praying for You. Pressing over me like a big blue sky, I know someone has me on their hearts tonight. That's why I know it's gonna be alright, 'cause somebody's praying you through. Somebody's praying you through. It may be my mother, it could be my dad, or it may be an old friend I forgot I had. But whoever it is, I'm so glad that somebody's praying you through. Somebody's praying me through. Through the tears, through the rain, through the sorrows, through the pain, it keeps bringing me through, over and over again. So when you're drowning in a sea of hurt, and it feels like your life couldn't get any worse, there's a blessing waiting to push back the curse, 'cause somebody's praying you through. Somebody's praying you through. Somebody's praying you through.
Amen.
As we open our Bibles to James chapter 1. And verse 2. Somebody read it for me, please.
My brethren, count it all joy when we fall into diverse temptations,
Verse 3.
knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience.
Let me begin my message this morning with a true story. A life-changing day. It started as a typical day for them in their 18-year marriage. He had an early morning flight and kissed her goodbye. Then, during her devotional time a few hours later, she kept receiving phone calls from a friend asking how Tom was and his whereabouts. Then another and another. She knew something was up, but she had no clue. Finally, the friend told Cheryl that a plane had been hijacked and to turn on the news. It was the morning of September 11, 2001. And Cheryl's husband, Tom, was a pilot for American Airlines. Soon, people started coming to her house with looks of concern on their faces. Then her pastor came to her house. And shortly after this, a big black car drove up to the house and several men in dark suits came up to the door. One of them, the chief pilot of the airline, told Cheryl that American Airlines Flight 11, for which Tom had been the co-pilot, was the first plane that crashed into the World Trade Center in New York, and there were no survivors. Shock overwhelmed her, and as she felt as though her heart had been ripped out, she had to hold on to her pastor's arms to keep from collapsing. I will finish this story shortly, but let me ask you a question. How would you handle a crisis like this?
All right.
Hold on to the answer to that question while I introduce my topic for this message. I want to talk to you this morning about how to bounce back higher when life knocks you down. And let me tell you where I got that title from. Imagine I have two balls in my hands, roughly the size of a large lemon. One is made of clay and the other of rubber. If I release each ball from the same height, each ball will hit the floor and bounce depending on what it's made of. The one made of clay will probably not bounce at all. It will just spread and squat and splat to the floor. On the other hand, the one made of rubber will bounce almost back to the same height from which it was dropped. In other words, the height to which a ball bounces back is a measure of the resilience of the material of which it is made. Resilience is the ability to recover from stress without permanent deformation. Now, this metaphor also applies to us. Our resilience is measured by our ability to bounce back from difficult situations. Some people are like the clay ball. When life knocks them down, they choose to stay on the ground and never recover. Notice I said choose. I'll explain that later. Some, on the other hand, are like the rubber ball. They choose to get back up and go on with their life as if nothing has happened. But there are some, and this is where there's a significant difference with the bouncing ball experiment. Because while a ball will never bounce back higher from the height from which it was dropped, the human spirit has the ability to bounce back higher from where it fell. In other words, you can face a crisis, and with God's help, you can choose to come out stronger than when you entered. The thesis or central idea of this message is this. The law, it's what someone has called the law of pain. Good management of bad experiences leads to great growth. Now I want to go back and finish my opening story because it beautifully illustrates this law in action. Despite having such a personally tragic connection with the 9/11 attacks, Cheryl McInnes did well under the circumstances. In Beauty Beyond the Ashes, a book she published 3 years after the event, she wrote, "As unfair, unreasonable, and impossible as it seems, we still have work to do after a tragedy occurs. We still have roles to fulfill. We still have responsibilities to family and others. The stuff of life may pause for a while, but it doesn't stop. Fair or not, that's just reality." Cheryl fulfilled her role with determination and strength. She planned Tom's funeral and even spoke of it, something which was way out of her comfort zone. She took care of her children, which were teenagers at the time. She started running her household as a single parent, and she learned rapidly how to deal with the difficulties of being a widow. Each new experience became a new opportunity for personal growth. Cheryl writes, and I quote, "I am learning more each day. The circumstances of 9/11 have forced me to examine who I am, to face myself in ways that I have never had before, to ask, what does God want from me? What can I do in Him by His power within me? How will He use me to touch others? I am learning more about myself and about God, and I am learning it on my own, not through Tom's filter." Cheryl says that she didn't realize until Tom was gone how lazy she had become. Before, she had depended on him to prompt her growth. Now, she was taking responsibility for herself. Today, Cheryl's children are grown. She has remarried, and she is content with her life. She was asked about the tragedy on its 10th anniversary. She said, "It's a terrible day, a terrible, terrible day. that I don't think anybody can forget, she said, but added, out of the ashes of September 11, out of the rubble of that day, I can emerge to say that I am stronger today than 10 years ago. That, my friends, is the power of the law of pain. Good management of bad experiences leads to great growth. Now, hopefully, none of us have had to go through a crisis as harrowing and devastating as this woman's. But how many of you would like to be able to face a crisis, even as difficult as hers, and come out as strong, come out on the other side as stronger? How many would you like to be able to do that? Of course, all of us. For the last years, I have been attracted by stories of people who have successfully come back from challenging circumstances, and I have studied them. Why? Because stories like Cheryl's give us hope that we too can come back in our circumstances. And even though every story is unique, I have found common themes that allow us to understand the principles behind the law of pain and how it works. In this message, I would like to explain what I have learned, and more importantly, how to make these principles work for you. And I will pepper this message with story after story of real life examples from both biblical and modern people. Now, our text says, count it all joy when you fall into different trials. Now, let's be clear on something. No one likes a crisis. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't look forward to having pain in my life. That's why verse 3 continues, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. In other words, we can rejoice in our trials, not for the trials themselves, but for what they produce. Does that make sense? Yes. And trust me, good management of difficult situations will be your period not only of growth, but of greatest growth. And that's why it's important to learn to handle adversity well. And with the help of God, I'm going to share with you what I am learning about how to do it. Are you ready? Okay, let's go. Matthew chapter 7, verse 24. A well-known scripture. Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 27. Somebody read it for me, please.
Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. And everyone that heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them not, shall be likened unto a foolish man, which built his house upon the sand.
Mm-hmm.
And the rain descended, and the floods came,
Mm-hmm.
and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell, and
Great was his fall.
of it.
Okay, thank you very much. I have structured my message under three main ideas, and this is the first one. Good management of bad experiences begins by understanding that the law of pain is a law. The law of pain is a law. Just like the law of gravity or the law of sowing and reaping. Now, the common characteristic of all laws is that they are universal, they are invariable, and without exception. Universal simply means that it applies to everyone, everywhere, every time. Invariables means that it does not change with time. It worked in biblical times, and it still works perfectly today. And without exceptions means it always works. Always, no exception. Now, this means for us, this means that there is hope for you in your case. Notice what Jesus said. He said, whosoever. That includes you and me. If you apply this law to your life, in your case, in your crisis, you will bounce back. You will grow. No doubts, no ifs, no buts. It will work, period. Amen. Now, as with any law, you can understand it and make it work for you, or you can ignore it and make it work against you. Notice that both the wise man and the foolish man face the same trial, exactly the same trial. But one came out strong and the other one ended in great ruin. Why? Because one applied the principles while the other one completely ignored them. This is the reason why we see two people facing exactly the same crisis. One takes his life while the other one thrives. And I wish I could tell you that if you love God and have faith and never have it, you will never have any difficulties. But that's just not true. That's just not reality. But I can tell you, based on what Jesus says here, that when the storms of life comes, if your house is built upon the rock, you will not, you cannot be defeated. Amen. And when it's all over, you will come out standing strong. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 1 through 3. 1 Samuel 30. Somebody please help me with the reading. 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verses 1 through 3. 1 Samuel chapter 30.
And it came to pass, David and his men were come to Ziklag, third day.
Amalekites.
Yes, had invaded the south. Ziklag is smitten and burned it with fire, and had taken the women captive, and were therein, and that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them all away, and went on their way. And David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captive.
My second point is this. Good management of bad experiences requires that we get over grief as quickly as possible. The next thing that is important to understand about the law of pain is that there are stages in grief. Grief is normal. It is the way we process pain. The key is not to try to run from grief and pain, but to get over it as quickly as possible. And in this story of David, we find a great example of just how to do that. David here has a serious crisis. Imagine coming home from work and your house burned down to the ground and your wife and kids gone. Is that a crisis or what? Okay? So the first thing you need to face a crisis is, well, a crisis. Now, if you don't have a crisis, too bad. Once President John F. Kennedy was asked how he became a war hero. And with his characteristic wit, he said, it was very easy. Someone sank my boat. The point is this. You don't have to look for a crisis. It will come. It's just a matter of time. Something or someone is going to sink your boat, and you will have a crisis. We live in an imperfect world full of imperfect people, and bad things happened. It's just part of the reality we have to face as long as we are on this side of eternity. And the crisis can be any situation. Maybe you just got bad news from a doctor. Or maybe you're into competitive sports or something, and you're dealing with failure and defeat. Maybe you're struggling with an addiction or some sort of besetting sin, and you've fallen into this thing again. You feel overwhelmed at work, or you feel stuck in a dead-end job, or you can't find a job, or you just lost your job. Maybe you're going through a rough situation academically, and you're wondering if you're going to pass this course and graduate, and you just need a good doses of hope. Maybe your marriage is on the rocks, and you wonder if you're going to make it through. You want to rekindle the love you once felt for each other. Maybe that relationship is damaged beyond repair, and you're struggling with a heart broken by deceit, betrayal, abuse, or injury. And you're on the verge of bitterness and resentment. Someone once said that death is not the greatest loss in life. The greatest loss is what dies inside of us while we live. Maybe you're grieving deeply because of this kind of loss. Someone close to you has just died, and something you once valued is no more. And you need perspective in your pain, and you need to journey forward in spite of your grief. Wherever this message finds you, I want you to know there's hope. You can face whatever life throws at you and come out stronger on the other side. Okay, so now you have your crisis. Now what? When tragedy occurs, most people go through a period of mourning. Notice what verse 4 says. Notice verse 4. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. Who said that men don't cry? Mind you, David and his men were warriors, not crybabies. So there's nothing wrong with crying when something bad happens. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign that you're human. Remember, even Jesus cried. So don't try to suppress your feelings, let them out. It's healthy for you. Tears represent pain that is leaving our body. Now, you don't have to, but in their grief, many people who are facing through a crisis, go through one or more of these stages. Number one, denial. Denial is when you simply refuse to accept what has happened. You cling to a false, preferable reality. It is basically a coping mechanism. You choose to believe that somehow the diagnosis is mistaken. You choose to believe they got the wrong person. Typical phrases of people in denial are, no, it can't be. This cannot be happening to me. Can I give you an example of this? Most of you know Brother Gary Tomlinson. He's in Brother Caton's congregation. His father died, I think it was 98. And he died in a taxi. And he and his mother had to go to the morgue and recognize the body and claim the body. And when they opened the drawer, the mother, Mrs. Tomlinson, slapped her husband. I mean, she had been married for, I think it was 40-something years. And she slapped him on the face and said, "Wake up, Tom. Wake up. It's time to go." The reality of it she was in denial. She couldn't, it was the first time in 40-something years that they had been separated. She was in denial. And by the way, Brother Tomlinson gave me permission to share this story. Anger, the second stage. Look at verse 6. Look at verse 6. Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and daughters. They were talking about stoning David. Was that going to return their wives and children? Of course not. They were in the anger stage. In the anger stage, you're looking for someone to blame. It could be the person you think is responsible, or it could be even yourself for not seeing it coming. Some people even lift a fist towards God and ask him, how could you let this happen? And typical phrases of people who are in this stage are, "Why me? It's not fair. How could this happen to me? Who's to blame? Why would this happen?" And this is a very, very dangerous stage, because your soul can be poisoned with bitterness and resentment. Stage number 3, depression. This is when the reality of what happened begins to sink in. And then there is a deep sadness and despair and hopelessness. You are in the doldrums, feeling dejected and deserted, disheartened. You basically want to call it quits. Many years ago, a lawyer suffered such a deep depression that his friends thought it best to keep away anything sharp from him. He wondered what his purpose of his life was, and if it was worth continuing. And during this time, he wrote, "I am the most miserable man. I do not know if I will ever get better and get out of this, and I have the terrible feeling that I will never be able to." Do you know who said that? Do you know who said that? Abraham Lincoln. That's right. The 16th president of the United States went through a period of deep depression. So if you think that this happens only to weaklings, think again. Even Jesus, the night he was betrayed, said, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death." Matthew 26:38. This can happen to anyone. So the problem is not that it happens, it's what you do what happens. And depression, like anger, is also a very dangerous stage because there are very strong emotions and you're tempted to make permanent decisions based on temporal feelings. Even Jesus wanted to back off from the cross, remember? And many people, unfortunately, make hasty decisions that have terrible consequences. For example, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, many people turn to substance abuse. Some commit acts of dishonesty that in normal circumstances they would not even consider. Others try to escape pain by abandoning everything. They just pick up and go. Some choose, unfortunately, to turn away from God. And some contemplate suicide. Now, if there's anything I have learned about crisis management is this: never, ever make important decisions when you are in denial, anger, or depression. Never. The fourth stage of grief is acceptance. This is when I embrace my new reality and continue on with my life as before. We saw that David and his men cried. Remember, that's okay. Get it out of your system. But how long are you going to cry? It's like my niece Alexandra says, take a bridge and get over it. And that's what David did in verse 6. Notice what verse 6 says. At the end, it says, "Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and daughters. But notice this, David strengthened himself in the Lord his God." You see, while everyone else was still in anger and depression, David was moving on towards acceptance. How did he do it? He found strength in God. Amen. So acceptance means that you accept your new reality. You embrace your new reality. You release the negativity about it and move forward. You see, as long as you are in denial, angry, or depressed, you're basically looking at a closed door. And if you keep staring at the closed door, you will not be able to see all the open doors around you. The fifth stage, growth. It's good to wipe the tears, release the past, accept my new reality, and move on. But there's more. There's growth. Notice what David did in verses 7 through 8. Someone read it for me, please. Verses 7 through 8.
And David said to Abiathar the priest, and to his son, I pray thee, bring me hither the ephod. And Abiathar brought hither the ephod to David. And David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, Pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all.
So what did David do? He consulted God. Now, the method he used is no longer relevant for us. But the question he put before God is, is definitely pertinent. Lord, what do you want me to do? And if you read the rest of the chapter, you will see that indeed David recovered everything that he lost and won much more. That is, he came out stronger. Now, the growth stage begins by asking yourself, am I going to go through this? Am I just going to go through this crisis? Or am I going to grow through this crisis? Will this thing make me bitter or better? Amen. Am I going to be a victim or a victor? Is this thing going to break me or make me? And you need to ask God, Lord, what do you want me to learn from this? How can I use this to become a better person? What work needs to be done in me through this difficulty? You see, sometimes when we're in pain, we are so eager to distance ourselves from the pain that we don't take time to learn from it. Now, while that is understandable, it's a mistake, a serious mistake. Why? Because sometimes God allows pain in our lives to call our attention to something. He's saying, I want you to take a look at this. It's like when you're driving your car and a little red light starts blimping on your dashboard. It's a warning signal. It's telling you that something is wrong and that you need to do something about it quickly. If you just ignore it and go on, something worse might happen or will happen. And that's why sometimes your circumstances will not change until you change.
That's right.
Now, I want to underline something here. It is not obligatory to grow in a crisis. It's a choice. It's always a choice. And you can choose to stay in denial, in anger, and depression, or acceptance. And many people actually do that. But as for me, I want to make this public, I have decided that every time I go through a difficult situation, I will come out stronger. Every single time, I will come out stronger. And you have my permission to call me on it. I simply will not waste a good crisis. And the way to do that is through your choices. And that leads me to my third main point. Good management of bad experiences requires that we choose to convert our pain into gain. Growth in a crisis is not going to happen by chance. It will only happen by choice. So let me give you some choices that you can make to change your pain into gain. Choice number one, Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 and 32. Ephesians 4:31. Someone read it for me, please.
Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Amen. And be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. Amen.
The first choice to change pain into gain is to choose to forgive.
Amen.
Forgiveness is a decision, not an emotion. It's a choice. And one of the greatest challenges for growth in a crisis is not being willing to forgive. After World War II, Dutch evangelist Corrie ten Boom opened up a shelter to minister to those who are affected by that horrible war. She says she noticed something very important. Those who were able to forgive their enemies were able to return to the outside world and rebuild their lives no matter how serious their scars were. In contrast, those who held on to resentment remained physically and emotionally disabled for the rest of their lives. I love that great quote that says, "To forgive is to free a prisoner, only to discover that the prisoner was you." It's important to understand that forgiveness is something you decide to do, not so much for the other person, but for yourself. Because holding resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And that's why Jesus began his teaching on forgiveness saying, take heed unto yourselves. Luke 17:3. And that's why Jesus said we should forgive how many times? Up to 70 times 7. And that's why Jesus modeled it on the cross when he prayed, Father, forgive them because they do not know what they're doing. And notice, no one asked him for forgiveness, but he forgave them anyway. In essence, Jesus was teaching us by word and example, don't let the evil of others affect you or infect you. Choice number 2. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 verses 9. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 verses 9 through 12. Somebody read it for me, please.
Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. Again, if two lie together, then they have heat. But how can one be warm alone?
Verse 12.
And if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him, and the three-fourth cord is not quickly broken.
The second choice to change pain into gain is to choose to let others get close. Don't try to go through your crisis alone. Get support. Once during the reign of Queen Victoria, she learned that the wife of a common worker had lost her baby. Having experienced deep grief herself, she felt moved to express her sympathy. So she visited the disconsolate woman and spent some time with her. When she left, the neighbors asked her, of course, what the queen had said. Nothing, the bereaved woman replied. She just laid her hands on mine and we cried together in silence. Now, as I tell this story, I can see all the sisters going like, oh, how sweet. And all the men are like, yeah. Now, I confess that this is a bit of struggle for me. Most men, opening up is kind of difficult for most men. So brothers, I understand, okay? But let me talk to you. Men, this is for you. Let me talk to you. If you're not into this touchy-feely stuff and you're like Brother Campbell was saying last night, you want facts, let me give you some facts. And this is something that helped me open up to the idea of opening up. We just read in the Bible that two are better than one. But did you know that research confirms it? Don't you love it when science has to turn around and say, hey, what God was saying all along was right? Well, this is an example. They did an experiment to measure the levels of cortisol in the monkey's brain. Now, cortisol is a hormone that mammals like monkeys and humans produce when they're under stress. It's a response to stress that allows us to fight or flight. So they took a monkey and put him in a cage and stressed him with all kinds of lights and noise, and they stressed the poor animal. And then they measured the amount of cortisol in the blood. Then they repeated the experiment, but this time they put another monkey in the cage. You know what happened? Even though the stress levels were on the exterior, on the outside, were exactly the same, the levels of cortisol were less than half. In other words, even though the external circumstances were exactly the same, the internal response was quite different, just by having a partner inside with him. That's the power of companionship. So men, this goes for you too. Don't try to go through your crisis alone. open up to someone you trust, preferably, of course, of the same sex, and ideally within the community of saints. That's one of the reasons why God left the church, so that we can rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep, Romans 12:15. So that we can bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, Galatians 6:2. And the reason why I said ideally within the church is because sometimes the nature of the problem or the crisis might require professional help. But however you look for support is not as important as the fact that you get it. The important thing is to let someone else come closer. Don't isolate yourself. You will discover that you will be able to handle your crisis much, much better. I remember personally, this was, 2012. Yes, 2012. July of 2012. I had been 6 months unemployed. I had estimated after my release from Ericsson that I would get a job within a few months. I'm an engineer by profession. I had a lot of experience. I'm well trained. And I thought it's a piece of cake to get another job. Piece of cake. I spent over 6 months trying to find a job. So discouraging was setting in. And then I had just received the devastating news that my mom had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. And she only had about 3 years more to live. And then thirdly, I had a serious discussion with my beloved wife. It wasn't just a trivial spat, it was a very serious discussion. And combined with the other two, that really sunk me into despair and depression. And I remember going to Brother Brewster and just sitting in his office and just let it, I just sat there and just broke down. And of course he gave me sage advice, but the important thing was I was able to let it out, just pour out my heart. And I felt much, much better after that. Choice number 3, 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. Second Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7.
Now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets of Elisha, saying, Thy servant my husband is dead, and thou knowest that thy servant is fear the Lord. And the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. And Elisha said unto her, What shall I do for thee? Tell me, what hast thou in thy house? And she said, Thine handmaid hath not anything in the house save a pot of oil. Then he said, Go, borrow these vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels. Borrow not a few.
Go on.
When thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thy sons, and shalt pour it out into all those vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. So she went from him, and shut the door upon her and upon her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said unto her son, Bring me yet a vessel. And he said unto her, There is not a vessel more, and the oil stayed. Then she came and told the man of God, and said, Go sell the oil and pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children of the rest.
The third choice to change pain into gain is to choose to focus on what you can control. Choose to focus on what you can control. There are many things you have absolutely no power over. You can't control the weather. You can't control your circumstances, most of them. You can't control other people, and as much as you would like to, you can't change the past. That's a fact. However, when you choose to focus on what you can control, you disempower yourself and you fall into despair. And what's worse, you lose sight of what you can control. This poor widow was so overwhelmed by her dire circumstances that she completely overlooked what she did have. Well, notice what the prophet asked her, what do you have? And she said, oh, just a little bit of oil there. And that little oil there ultimately turned to be out her salvation. So remember, as long as you remain staring at a closed door, you won't be able to see all the open doors around you. So stop complaining about what you don't have and focus on what you do have. And do the best you can with what you have where you are. The widow did exactly that. She used what little she had, put it in the hands of God, and God used it to take her out of her crisis. Chapter 50 of Genesis, choice number 4. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Choice number 4. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20.
But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive.
The fourth choice to change pain into gain is to choose to keep the right perspective. Now let me explain this concept a little bit. How many of you are familiar with soccer? Young people back there, how many of you are familiar with soccer? All right. For those of you who aren't, let me just give you some details. In soccer, any difference of 3 goals or more is considered a sound defeat or victory, depending on what side you're on. Now, in the 2014 World Soccer Cup, Brazil was crushed by Germany 7-1. That was in the last World Cup. This year's cup, that just finished in July, England ran over Panama 6-1. When Brazil lost, of course, Brazilian fans were crying. But when Panama lost, we were celebrating wildly, as if we had won the World Cup. In fact, when they came back to Panama, they were paraded through the streets like heroes. I mean, the celebrations made headlines all over the world. And the comment was, England won the game, but Panama won the hearts. What was the difference between Brazil and Panama? Very simply, a difference of perspective. While Brazil was focused on the 7 goals against them, we were focused on our first goal in the World Cup. Our first goal. The first time we participated in a World Cup and the first time we scored. So we were focusing on this. So you see, the principle is this. Whatever you focus on, you enlarge.
All right.
So when you're in a crisis, whatever you focus on makes a world of a difference. What does Isaiah 26:3 says? You will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed where? On the crisis? No, on you. That's a principle. And Joseph very clearly understood this principle. He correctly understood that his suffering was not all about him. He understood that it was part of a bigger picture, a bigger plan that God had for him, for his family, and now we know that in fact it was a plan that involved the whole world. And Joseph was a part of it. He understood. He correctly understood that his suffering was not about all about him. And you can do the same. In your crisis, you can choose to remember it's not all about you. That God has a plan that is bigger than you. Excuse me. So, instead of dwelling on that humiliating defeat, you can choose to say, God, I thank you because I know that all things work together for good for them that love God. Romans 8:28. Instead of reading that medical report for the 27th time, you can choose to say, God, I thank you because I know you care for me. 1 Peter 5:7. Instead of rehashing all the harm that that person did to you, you can choose to say, God, I know that I thank you. I know because I know that you are not against me, you are for me. Psalms 56:9. Instead of complaining about how hard this trial is, you can choose to say, Lord, I thank you because I know you will not put on me more than I can handle. 1 Corinthians 10:13. Instead of praying, Lord, you gotta get me out of this situation today. I can't stand it any longer. You can pray and say, Lord, I thank you because I know this too will soon pass away. 2 Corinthians 4:17. Instead of talking about how big your problems are, you can choose to talk about how big God is, like David did when he faced Goliath. Have you ever noticed that David never gave Goliath credit for being that big? Whenever David referred to Goliath, he always referred to him as what? An uncircumcised Philistine. He never gave him credit for how big he was. He said, I'm going to focus on something, I'm going to focus on the size of my God. Now, please don't get me wrong. Don't hear me saying that I'm asking you to put your head in the ground, ignore reality, and act as if nothing happened. That's not faith. That's denial. We already covered that. And Brother Campbell was exactly right last night when he said that he is a realist. Why? Because faith requires the discipline to confront the facts of my reality, however brutal, and yet maintain an unwavering faith that I can and I will prevail in the end. And you can do that by changing your focus, not by dwelling on the problem. Dwell on the promise. Keep the right perspective, and in time, you will, like Joseph, like David, come out of your crisis stronger.
Amen. Amen.
How many of you love that wonderful hymn, It Is Well With My Soul? Remember that song?
Amen.
Do you know the circumstances behind that song? Horatio Spafford was a prominent lawyer, a senior partner in a large and thriving law firm. He and his wife were also devout Christians and prominent supporters of and close friends with evangelist Dwight L. Moody. In 1873, Spafford decided that his family should take vacations somewhere in Europe. And he chose England because he knew that his friend D.L. Moody would be preaching there in the fall. He was delayed because of business, so he sent his family ahead. His wife and his 4 daughters, ages 11, 9, 5, and 2. On November 22, 1873, while crossing the Atlantic, the steamship Ville du Havre was struck by an iron sailing vessel, and 226 people lost their lives, including all 4 of Spafford's daughters. Anna Spafford alone survived the tragedy. Upon arriving in England, she sent a telegram to Spafford beginning, "Saved alone." And then Spafford quickly sailed to England to join his bereaved wife. And while he was going there, the captain of the ship told him that at this moment they were passing over what would probably be the grave of his 4 daughters. And in those circumstances, Spafford wrote, "When peace like a river," sing it with me, "attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." Then the second stanza says, "Though Satan should buffet, though trial should come, let this blessed assurance control, that Christ has regarded my helpless estate and has shed his own blood for my soul. Of all the things that were going through his mind, he chose to say, "It is well with my soul." That, my friends, is to choose to keep the right perspective. Choice number 5. Are we learning something?
Yes.
Choice number 5, Psalm 34. We're all finished. Psalms 34, verse 18. The 5th choice to change pain into gain is to choose to let God help you. Remember how when we read that David strengthened himself in Jehovah his God? You can do the same. Psalms 34, verse 18.
I will give thee thanks in the great congregation.
Is that it? Psalms 34, verse 18.
Unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such that be of a contrite spirit.
The word contrite in this context literally means crushed. When you feel that life has given you a crushing blow, you don't have to go through it alone. God is there with you to help you. Now, you know these promises. Just listen to them. Just close your eyes and just listen to these promises. These things I have spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. John 16:33. Isaiah 41, verse 10. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Isaiah 43, verse 2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor the flame scorch you. And our beloved Psalm 43, verse 4 says, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And this beautiful scripture, this beautiful prophecy in Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 says, The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and opening of the prison of those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to console those who mourn in Zion, to give them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they may call trees of righteousness the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. Now you remember that Jesus fulfilled exactly this prophecy. He came to heal the brokenhearted. And God has ordered beauty for your ashes in your case.
Thank the Lord.
And as a bonus, he can help you with the other choices that I have mentioned. He can help you forgive. He can help you find someone to support you. He can help you do the best you can with what you have. He can help you keep the right perspective. But you got to give him the chance and the permission. You have to choose to give him permission to act on your behalf. Remember, it's a choice. It's always a choice. Before I close this message, would you allow me to share one last story of how God helped someone in her crisis? Imagine that you had cancer for a number of years, and that just recently the doctors discovered that it is no longer in remission. Not only that, but the disease has damaged your liver so badly that only a transplant can save you. So you're on the waiting list for a new one, but no one knows when a donor might be found. In the same time frame, your spouse has suffered both a stroke and a heart attack. that has left him blind and weak, and very weak. The final blow comes when your employer announces that your job has been terminated. You are the sole support of your household, and within a few weeks, all of your medical benefits will end along with your paycheck. Is it possible to remain fearless in the midst of all that? I know it is, because I have personally witnessed it. I got this story, let me insert a parenthesis here. I'm reading a story, and I got this story from a book that from a conference I attended here in the States a few years ago, and I had the privilege of actually speaking with the author of this book. And she continues saying this story. That was actually the story of a beautiful woman named Jean, who had been assigned to me for outplacement counseling. I quickly learned that she was a believer who knew there was absolutely no way she could handle all that she was facing on her own. So together we took the entire situation to the Lord and left it at his feet. At the end of our session, Jean made this statement: "There is nothing I can do about this. But I will not fear. This is way too big for me, so I'm leaving it with the Lord. I will trust him and I will stay in peace. Now I'm going to go home and spend time with my husband and wait what the Lord will do." Jean certainly sounded like she meant what she said. I never saw her again, but I did get a call from her 3 months later. Naturally, I asked how she was doing, and this is what she told me. "I went home and did exactly what I said I was going to do. My husband and I puttered around the house, fixing the house, reading the word and praising God. We had a wonderful time together. I continued to sing in my church choir and volunteered for little projects. During this time, God healed both my husband and me. My white blood cell count is now normal, and the doctors can find no sign of cancer. I'm even off the waiting list for a donor because my liver is healing and I no longer need it. My husband is stronger and able to see again. He walks to the church a few times a week and serves as an associate pastor part-time, something he always wanted to do. Not only that, but the company just called and offered me my old job back, and with a better title and a much higher salary. Apparently, they discovered my position was critical and I had the skills they needed. So I had a wonderful break from my work, and now God has restored everything unto me. I never lost one night of sleep, and I never spent one moment worrying. It was the greatest experience of my life." I mean, this story is like deja vu of Job all over again. And it is a great example, another example of the law of pain in action. As we close, let me summarize my main points. The law of pain states, good management of bad experiences leads to great growth. And the good management of bad experiences begins by understanding that the law of pain is a law. We can apply these principles and let them work for us, or ignore them and let them work against us. Secondly, good management of bad experiences requires that we get over grief as quickly as possible. It's okay to grieve, and you don't necessarily have to go through all or any of the stages of grief. It's okay. But get over it as quickly as possible and move on. And good management of bad experiences requires that we choose to convert our pain into gain. Growth is not going to happen by chance, only by choice. And you can choose to forgive. You can choose to find support. You can choose to focus on what you can do. You can choose to keep the right perspective, and you can choose to ask God for his help. Do this, and I guarantee, God guarantees that you will turn your test into a testimony, for sure. Amen. Now, I don't know where this message finds you. Perhaps you are in a crisis, leaving one, or about to enter one. And I don't know what God wants to accomplish with it. But one thing I can assure you is this: you can come out stronger than when you entered. In Panama, there's a continental divide. As you know, Panama is a very narrow country. And I've been there. There are places where you can stand and look to one side and you'll see the Pacific Ocean, and look to the other on a very clear day, of course, and see the Atlantic. Now, think with me for a second. 2 drops of rain that fall, let's say 1 meter apart, but they fall on different sides of the continental divide, will have very different endings. One will end up in the Pacific, the other one will end up on the Atlantic. If there's one thing I want you to take home from this message, is this: the continental divide that determines how you will come out on the other side is a choice. It's your choice. You decide whether you stay on the ground or bounce back higher. It's a choice. It's always a choice. As for me, I have decided to come out stronger every single time. How about you? If this is your determination, I invite you to stand together and let us read 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 10, and then I will pray for you. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10. Let us read together. But may the God of all grace, who called us to eternal joy by Christ Jesus, after you have suffered a while, after you have suffered a while, after you have suffered a while, perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. To him be the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen.